Don, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to just quickly go ahead and also acknowledge some important people. I want to thank definitely God walking me through this program, my parents who sacrificed a lot for me. Also Dr. Dunn, just being that firm advisor, just getting me through the process, believing in me, and always being an expert, just supporting me through every aspect, every season of the last 8 years. Thank you so much. Without your support, I would not make it here today. And Dr. Fenster, you always say, Christina, you got the big D. So thank you again for that. And Dr. Skank, thank you so much for joining us all the way overseas. It was a blessing, and it is continued to be a blessing to come across your research and to engage in conversation with someone who is equally as passionate about cultural values and leadership preferences. And last but not least, I'd like to really thank the university and the School of Education for giving me this opportunity to be able to, partake in this doctoral defense today. So thank you so much. It's just a quick agenda on the screen that you can see. I will be going over through each of the items, hopefully quickly and efficiently. As you can see the problem statement here, the enrollment of students in the United States public school system is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. According to research, students of color benefit from the classroom dynamics that diversity creates, as well as from having teachers and leaders who look like them. However, the ethnic and racial diversity of teachers and leaders in education currently does not seem to reflect this changing landscape. Specifically, there is a disparity in the percentage of Asian American principals compared to Asian American students. When digging into the literature, it attributes a lack of a significant presence of Asian Americans in educational leadership positions to stereotypes and racism, citing an alleged lack of leadership qualities due to cultural differences. When examining prior research, three themes seem to come up. There was a lack of literature just focusing on education, so I did have to expand and look at business literature as well. But it was interesting to note that Asian Americans have high educational attainment. However, there is that discrepancy that exists when examining their upward mobility in terms of the workforce. And so Asian Americans tend to experience negative perceptions such as stereotypes and biases when seeking leadership opportunities. And oftentimes these negative perceptions come about because of the lack of understanding the cultural differences. So again, the literature does point to the importance of looking at the difference in values and that semantics, which highlight the need to really look at this particular subgroup and how they are being engaged in terms of leadership opportunities. Again, understanding the nuance of both Asian American cultures and the acceptance of these stereotypes can definitely and negatively impact this subgroup. So again, the purpose of this research was to really address that limited, that gap in the research. So by doing so, I explored the cultural values of Asian Americans and their impact on leadership preferences in order to address those stereotypes and those perceptions. The rationale as to why this particular subgroup, according to Pew Research Center, Asians are projected to become the largest immigrant group, making up 38% of the U.S. immigrants in the country, while Hispanics will make up 31%, non-Hispanic whites 20%, and Blacks 9% of the nation's immigrant population by 2055. And according to the U.S. Department of Education, currently the elementary and secondary educator workforce is overwhelmingly homogeneous, consisting of 82% white, non-Hispanics, despite the increase in teachers and leaders of color. Again, the lack of teachers and leaders of color is a concern because according to the U.S. Department of Ed, about 50% of the public school student population is non-white, and the percentage is expected to increase in the years to come. So again, literature points out that racially diverse leaders can improve the school experiences of students by serving as positive role models, breaking down those negative stereotypes, and improving overall student outcomes. So again, that is the rationale for this particular study. The significance is about points to three different reasons. Again, there is a gap in the literature, so there is a need. Second of all, it is important to bring awareness and address the the bamboo ceiling. It's a term coined by a researcher, Jane Hyun. It's an invisible barrier that really impedes that upward mobility, kind of like how the glass ceiling does for women. According to Hyun, this bamboo ceiling consists of that stereotype and the discrimination that Asian Americans face when, which may contribute to their underrepresentation in educational leadership roles. So lastly, number 3, it is important to bring to light the cultural values that may have programmatic implications in the future. According to researchers, there is a need in principal preparation programs to strengthen aspiring school leaders and current school districts to provide ongoing training and mentoring in areas such as race, gender, and other important identity markers. So again, this Asian American cultural value set is equally and important, vitally important as well when compared to other groups. 3 research questions were examined for this dissertation. The first one really looks at the preference for Asian American cultural values, whether it differs significantly between both Asian American, non-Asian American principals. The same question for the second one, but looking at preference for leadership styles. And the third one is to really look at the preference for Asian cultural values in relation to the leadership preference for both Asian American and non-Asian American principals. This research was grounded in the theoretical framework of the Asian critical theory. In short, it's called Asian Crit. The Asian Crit was really built upon the critical race theory. Mucius and Iftikhar in 2014 developed the Asian Crit theory because they realized that by just looking at the CRT, it tends to just look at the intersection of race and gender for African Americans and whites, and it doesn't really look at the intersectionality of the uniqueness of the Asian American subgroup when you look at their issues and their own experiences. So they did use the CRT as a base to build their tenets. And so the first 4 tenets really do focus on the uniqueness of the Asian American, and the 3 kind of reference the original CRT tenets when looking at their issues and their experiences. So as you can see on the screen, there are 7 tenets, and this particular research focused on the first tenet, Asianization, and the 7th tenet, commitment to social justice. This figure illustrates the conceptual framework that was used for this study. Again, if you look at the very bottom here, the first tenet, let me just move that. The first tenet, Asian Crit, tenet 1, Asianization. This is to really help to deconstruct stereotypes by looking at the barriers that are being created, such as the bamboo ceiling. And if you look at the very top, by addressing the bamboo ceiling, we are taking a step closer to cracking the bamboo ceiling and hopefully making a mark in that pathway to commitment to social justice. But how are we doing that? This research focused on looking at Asian cultural values in relation to leadership styles. And by doing so, we're trying to look at this through an asset-based lens so we can help deconstruct those stereotypes in hopes eventually to provide more leadership opportunities for Asian Americans. The methodology, now we will go into this section. This research, the survey was administered to the state of California. Within the state of California, it had the largest Asian American population. 13 different school districts allowed the survey to be distributed, a total of 762 principals, in which only 144 came back, consisting of 40 Asian American respondents and 104 non-Asian American respondents. The response rate was 19%. Each participant received a Survey Monkey consisting of 80 questions. The survey had 11 demographic questions, 42 from the Asian American Value Scales, AAVSM, and 27 items from the Van Civico Leadership Survey, also known as the VLS. Survey was open for a total of 4 weeks, and reminder emails were sent at the 2nd and 4th week marks. The research design is a quantitative study. We are looking at both Asian American and non-Asian American groups, explore the relationship of looking at the independent variable, which is the AAVSM, the Asian American cultural values, to the dependent variable, which is the leadership styles through the VLS. Empirical differences between the 2 groups were gauged by using the parametric t-test, and then the relationship between the independent and dependent variable was used by looking at the Pearson product moment correlation coefficient, and all statistical tests was set at the conventional alpha level of 0.05. For the first question that looks at The Asian values, Likert results from the AAVSM were averaged to obtain 1 overall score, means were compared, t-test was conducted. Same process for the second question, but again, this one focused on the leadership preferences. So again, the VLS was used for that. And then the third question looked at the there we go, the values and the leadership styles using the Pearson product moment correlation. In addition, the AAVSM total was looked at across the 9 leadership styles, and then covariates were also examined, the gender and the immigrant generational status using the t-test and the multiple regression. In terms of reliability and validity, both instruments were tested for that. The question about social desirability was posed, and so one way to reduce it was to ensure that the surveys were self-administered and that there was no presence of the researcher. So again, by disseminating the survey through SurveyMonkey, it accomplished that at this time. Now we'll go into the results of each of the research questions. As you can see on the screen, the first research question, or the results from the first research question reveal that Asian American principals had higher mean values for all 5 of the Asian cultural values compared to non-Asian American principals. Specifically, 3 out of 5 were statistically significant for both, and the statistical significance may be contributed to both respondent groups answering the AAVSM for the perspective of the welfare of the group. There's a strong emphasis of the Confucian value of Ren, which focuses on, really putting the group needs before your own. And so that is really threaded through all of the Asian cultural values. So specifically, these 3 that were significant really highlight that, and it can be seen through the different survey statements. There is definitely a difference in cultural orientation among Asian Americans and non-Asian Americans, which can be seen as a deficit for current and aspiring Asian American leaders. The Asian American cultural emphasis on collectivism and humility play a factor in hindering the promotion of some Asian Americans as they strive not to stand out, put others' needs ahead of theirs, and not boast about their accomplishments. In terms of the cultural value of conformity to norms, honoring the hierarchy by not deviating from those norms, Asian cultural emphasis on valuing emotional self-control through minimal expression were also found to be leadership barriers in general in research. So when we think about these Asian cultural norms, which are in contrast to behaviors that are reflected in the Western context, such as taking risks by making decisions, or deviating from the hierarchical structure, or not engaging in interpersonal communication, all of these are aspects that we have to take into consideration when we think about, how are we viewing Asian cultural or Asian American leaders? Are we looking at them through the lens of a deficit or an asset-based lens? So acknowledging that there are cultural differences, the next research question will examine leadership preferences for Asians and non-Asian American principals. So again, research question 2 looked at the preference for leadership styles. Both respondent groups ranked the same top 4 leadership styles, such as transformational, democratic, transformational, and so forth, as you can see on the screen. A possible explanation for both respondent groups to have similar top 4 rankings may consist of each group identifying with an aspect of transformational leadership style based on their own cultural value and orientation. So according to research, Asian collectivistic cultures tend to be group-based, whereas in the Western, it tends to be more dyad-based and individualistic. So when we think about transformational leadership style, it really involves developing a close relationship with leaders and followers that's based on trust and that interpersonal relationship, and really eliciting ideas from subordinates and having them participate. And oftentimes, these may be in contrast to the Asian cultural values where hierarchy and structures, conformity to norms are respected. So Asian American respondents may identify with transformational leadership style due to Confucian value of the concept of Ren, which again focuses on putting others before you. Because sometimes transformational leadership style involves leaders helping followers to construct and develop that shared vision by transcending themselves and putting others before them. So that is an aspect to consider. And then, when we think about the other values, like the democratic values of the group, the lower mean values for Asian Americans, if you see on the screen here. So this may be explained through the violation of the Confucian virtue of Li, which really focuses on positional authority. And so as we think about the lower mean values, there is a conflict of democratic and transformational leadership styles not being incongruent with that particular Confucian value. Furthermore, when we think about Asian American, for this second research question, Asian American principles, they were significant, statistically significant in regards to autocratic and transactional leadership styles. This does reflect the influence of power distance and defined roles, which again goes back to that Confucian virtue of Li. And the overall mean averages for the Likert values suggest that Asian American respondents prefer that autocratic and transactional form of leadership more so than their Asian American counterparts. So both groups, they were statistically significant when it came to autocratic transformational leadership style. That may be the case for non-Asian American principals because sometimes principals, administrators, they are the authority figure, and they're ultimately responsible for the school and the organization to build staff capacity. So that may be a consideration. In addition, literature states that transformational aspect of the autocratic transformational really does reflect that Western value of having that charisma, really engaging with followers and developing that relationship. In terms of Asian Americans, again, going back to that concept of Ren, which was also found in other researchers, they found that really transcending and putting oneself and putting the group before oneself is a driving factor in terms of this particular Asian American subgroup. So to further investigate the impact of beliefs on leadership styles, the third research question, explore the impact of Asian cultural values on the leadership styles. Just briefly here, as you can see on the screen, out of all 9 leadership styles, transactional and democratic transactional leadership style had the most significant correlation for Asian American. For non-Asian American, it was that autocratic and autocratic transformational. When looking at the total AVSM average scores, it was also similar for both subgroups. What was interesting to note in this study that even though in the previous slide I mentioned that pure and hybrid forms of transactional leadership styles were significant for Asian Americans, and then non-Asian Americans, it was the autocratic and autocratic transformational. What I'd like to really bring to attention today was that there were some significant correlations. Although there were just one significant correlation for Asian Americans, there were some for pure and hybrid transformational styles. And to me, as I began to explore this topic, it made me wonder, are Asian Americans able to integrate their ethnic heritage while adopting a Western orientation? And so again, when digging into leadership, literature review, it did show in some research that Asian Americans may be able to navigate both. Again, covariates were examined as well, gender and immigrant generational status. When looking at gender on both variables, AAVSM and BLS, there was no statistical significance. However, for non-Asian Americans, there were statistical significance for the total AAVSM scores. Again, looking at gender, there was no, the non-Asian American principal group showed statistically insignificant results with respect to gender and total VLS, but they did show significance for the AVSM score. And then when looking at gender and immigrant generational status, again, for Asian Americans, there was no significance, but for the non-Asian American principals, again, right here, the non-Asian American respondent group, they did have statistical significance where the beta coefficient for non-Asian American males were higher than females in respect to gender and AAVSM scores. The elements of the AAVSM survey may mirror non-Asian American respondents perception of autocratic leadership, where both Asian cultural values emphasize the importance of having control and achieving success, which may reflect aspects of autocratic and autocratic transformational leadership styles, where the supervisor is in control of decision-making, and ultimately the success of the organization. And again, Confucianism, which tends to be a status-based positional worldview, may cause non-Asian American respondents to view leadership from a status-based perspective. So thus, going back to earlier, the autocratic and autocratic transactional leadership style, this particular non-Asian American group may identify with that in this particular research. I'd like to quickly reference the theoretical framework. I believe this is the important part of the research that we're all leading towards. I don't want to miss out on this. I'm also looking at the clock real quick. So again, the Asian Crit Tenet 1, this particular tenet really does the Asianization focus on deconstructing stereotypes. In a nutshell, for this particular tenet, it's important for because the research showed, the data show that, Asian Americans can navigate both their ethnic Asian cultural heritage and also the Western orientation. It's important that this subgroup is set up for success so that they can engage in cultural frame switching. As you can see on the screen, cultural frame switching really consists of the individual being able to leverage their own cultural values, but also kind of look at the situation at hand, look at the culture that they're in, and be able to determine how you navigate the situation and which value do you leverage in that moment that is specific to the need and the situation at hand. So when you think of Asian cultural values, it tends to be looked at in a deficit. If the individual is able to kind of engage in that cultural frame switching and they're able to utilize, when do I do X, when do I do Y, and how do I bring it together for the success of the group, I believe that is how, one will be able to deconstruct those stereotypes. And so I'm going to go ahead and kind of hit these 3 points here. The one way we will be able to, through this research, commit to social justice in attacking or breaking the bamboo ceiling or attempting to crack at it is to really look at these 3 pieces here: the leadership development for Asian Americans, creating ethnic networks and mentorship in school districts, and building the cultural proficiency for non-Asian Americans. Results from the study suggest that Asian American principals need to achieve awareness and develop their own skills to leverage their both Asian and Western values, again, as they engage in that cultural frame switching, which will really enhance their leadership. There are national nonprofit organizations like LEAP, Leadership Education for Asian Pacifics, and also AAPA, Asian American Professional Association. These are great nonprofits for school districts to partner with if they don't know of any, because a lot of these organizations will help cater and differentiate training for school districts and help to address the individual unique experiences or the struggles or the difficulties that Asian Americans may face when trying to navigate, leveraging their own values and trying to adapt to that Western context at the same time. In terms of ethnic networks and mentorship, many Asian Americans have developed ethnic networks based on the commonality of shared language, culture, and professional experiences. And oftentimes these networks can serve as vehicles to help provide information, know-how, create role models, and oftentimes it allows one to create opportunities for mentoring and risk-taking. Oftentimes this is in contradiction to the Asian American culture, where it's all about hard work and not receiving help from others. So this may be a challenge, but by creating these opportunities of ethnic networks and mentorship opportunities, this will really help Asian Americans to build trust and form relationships, which then can in turn hone and build their own leadership skills while also cultivating their own Asian cultural values. Again, these will be beneficial for schools, districts to utilize. And last but not least, it can't just be done alone, but everybody has to be involved, including non-Asian Americans. And so training that consists of literature, workshops, or classes to really help just open their eyes in terms of highlighting the nuances in culture will be important. Again, this responsibility does not fall on this particular subgroup, Asians or just the non-Asians, but it really is everybody to have that shared learning to enhance their own leadership. And again, research does point to the importance of self-awareness, and learning the perception of others, really examining your own biases, your own value lens, and familiarizing yourself with the Asian American culture and their values. So that would be very important. There are some limitations to the study. Again, the number of participants were very low. Next time, I would love to see maybe a couple more states, not just California, but again, the next state that had the high number of Asian population was Texas, New York, and New Jersey. Again, the survey, the instrument, again, I wonder if distributing the first survey may have measured Asian cultural values, but it may have impacted their response on the second survey, which was the leadership preference. But again, at this time, the survey was all put together and sent in one at once because I wanted to ensure that there was a good return rate. Again, covariates such as gender and immigrant and generational status were examined, but reasons for their disparities were not examined in detail. So again, I would like to kind of see that in the future. And last but not least, Confucian virtues, although these were emphasized as Asian cultural values, the researcher, as a researcher, I would like to maybe see a larger sample size of Asian American respondents and not just from East Asian countries, although this particular study, over half were for East Asian countries. And last but not least, suggestions for future research. I would like to consider disaggregating the non-Asian American group, as I had about 104, to determine if there were any differences in regards to Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic Black, and the white non-Hispanic principles and Asian American principles. Because there's literature on Latino critical race theory, also known as LatCrit, and again, we have CRT that could be used as a theoretical framework to look at the potential differences and expanding the groups, the analysis from 2 to 4. Also, maybe using a different survey, because again, this particular survey, the author, the developer of the survey did acknowledge that it was predominantly East Asian groups. But again, if the survey is being disseminated to the larger umbrella of Asian Americans, we have to also think about different ethnic groups like, Southeast Asian countries, and not just Chinese, Filipino, Korean, and Japanese Americans that were used to construct the AAVSM. And leadership training, I propose that there's a need for leadership training that, oftentimes it is complex and layered when we think about Confucian philosophy on Asian cultural values. So it will be really important to look at leadership training that really does encompass not just Chinese, Filipino, Korean, and Japanese, but the larger Asian American subgroup. And last but not least, the most important, I think, I would like to capture the lived experiences of Asian American principals regarding the racism or challenges that they face when pursuing a leadership opportunity. And I think that could further unpack Asian Crit tenets 1 and 7 to make the research more rich had it been a quantitative and qualitative piece added to this particular research. It is 2:03 at this time. This concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. At this point, we'd like to ask if there are any questions for Christina from the committee.
I have one quick question, and I think you alluded to this early on in your presentation, but please remind me. To what extent were these first generation immigrants, second generation, or maybe even third generation? And did you distinguish in any way?
Yes. In the paper, I did distinguish. I'm sorry, I had to fly through because I only had 20 minutes.
It's totally understandable. Great presentation, by the way.
Absolutely. So first generation, is like someone like my parents, right? They were born in Korea. They are adults and they come to the US as adults, for a better life. So maybe my parents were in their like 30s when they came. 1.5 is someone who would come over like in high school, maybe like towards the end of middle school and high school. So they're 1.5. Second generation would be someone myself. I was born here in the United States in Maryland. So I would be second generation. And then if I had a child, my child would be a third generation.
Yeah, my question is, I understand the different types of immigrants, but my question is more, to what extent was your sample, how was that within your sample?
Yes. So what was
very
interesting,
relevant.
Dr. Decline, very good question. So what was interesting is there was no no difference in terms of generation. And so when I went back into the literature, what was interesting to note, the author, the developer of the Asian American Values multidimensional the survey, he himself also found that there was no difference in in generation, and there was, which is contrary to research, because once you come over, the longer you are here, technically, you kind of lose some of the values from your home country. But what this author found is when they administered the survey themselves, they found, or the Asian value survey, they found that fourth generation Japanese Americans tend to be higher in terms of their values compared to recent immigrants. And so they kind of wondered why. And so the explanation that was given was because they've been so removed from their country, they are that much more adamant to kind of sustain and keep their culture relevant to them, more so than someone that would just come over the following year. And so to me, I wonder if that is the case with the Asian American participants in this survey. Again, I would not know, but I guess that I would be interested in exploring that later on. Again, I think having a larger sample size would also help. But I also think it was a struggle to find more fourth generation, third and fourth generation. A lot of the participants in this survey were similar to me. They were either second generation or 1.5, some 1. And so it just also makes me wonder, if we look at the history of the Asian American immigration, it hasn't been that long, to be quite honest. And so I just wonder if we just need more time to kind of see how that will pan out.
And in terms of your own sample, what percentage was first generation versus 1.5 versus 2?
Yes, I have it right here.
I mean, I guess you're making the point it wasn't really relevant in the first place, maybe, right? So
right.
I'm curious about this.
Yes, yeah. So first generation was 12.5% for Asians. 27.5 was 1.5 generation. Second generation was the biggest, over half, 52.5%. And then third generation was like 7%.
Yeah, that could really, those numbers, well, if you assume that it doesn't make a difference, then it shouldn't make a difference here. But it seems to me that might have influenced your results quite a bit. And if I can ask one other quick question, you talk about East Asia, the East Asian culture, the East Asian group, but it seems to me that there could, and I am not familiar with the Asian cultures at all, but it seems to me that could vary quite a bit from ethnic group within the Asian population versus, country of origin, etc. Right? I mean, to what extent is it justified to lump them all together? Would be another sort of direct way of asking that.
No, you bring up a very good point. I'm going to be honest. I think one thing that I really struggle with this is, and I've seen different researchers take on different, different sort of perspective. So again, when looking at the umbrella of Asian Americans, a lot of the research tends to focus on East Asian, so Japanese, Korean American, Chinese, and so forth. There's not a lot on Southeast Asian countries. When we also look at so those 4 countries that I just talked about, the East Asian, a lot of these countries also share Confucianism, but a lot of Southeast Asian countries may not share in this Confucian philosophy. And so, lumping the Asian American group as one and saying that East Asian countries tend to represent this, I think that is a shortcoming. I think we need to round ourselves out and look at more. So that was my suggestions for future research, maybe using a different instrument.
But I'm also asking the opposite, which is within that East Asian group, are there significant differences between Japanese and Chinese, for instance? Again, my knowledge is
Right.
But you're talking about a number of, very large countries. I would say is that justified to lump those together?
That is a great question. So to address your question about, even within this group of these, let's say 4 countries, East Asian countries, what is different from Japanese versus Koreans versus Chinese? That would be interesting to note as well. Again, what the approach that I took using previous literature was to kind of look at Confucianism to band these groups together. But, some countries also have Taoism. I know, so every, that is a good point to look at. And I think that it needs to be addressed.
But I think, Christina, what you were really using as your guide is that there's a collectivist culture versus a US individualist culture. And, yes, we could, parse these out in future studies, but for your purposes, you were looking at Asian American values as very good of the group versus good of me, which is in stark contrast to sort of the American way or the American leadership way, certainly in the business literature.
Yes, and definitely, I was looking at the difference in cultural orientation, individualism versus collectivism. But if we go down that rabbit hole, that tunnel, I'd be curious to kind of take a tooth comb and wonder, again, if I had a larger sample size, I'd wonder how would the straws land when we look at just Japanese, Chinese versus Korean versus Filipino. Is there something that sort of sets this subgroup within the subgroup? Does it set them apart? Again, that'd be curious. I would love to see that kind of research come out. But yes, Dr. Dunn is you're right. I just looked at the difference in cultural orientation.
Thanks, excellent, great study.
No, these are great questions. I'm gonna write